The day had started quietly, with the sound of doors opening and closing as customers walked in and out of the small grocery store. The soft hum of the refrigerators filled the background, while the faint sound of a radio played somewhere behind the counter. Among the people who entered was an elderly woman, moving slowly but carefully. She held a small piece of paper in one hand, her shopping list written in neat handwriting. In the other hand, she clutched a small cloth purse that looked worn from years of use. She walked through the aisles, stopping at each shelf with patience, picking up only the items she truly needed. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a small bag of rice, and a few vegetables. She looked at everything twice, sometimes putting things back as if weighing her options carefully. Her eyes lingered on some items she clearly wanted but did not take, as though she had learned long ago how to choose only what fit within the limits of her purse. There was a gentleness about her movements, but also a quiet weight, the kind that comes from living with worry about whether every coin will stretch far enough. By the time she reached the counter, she had gathered just enough for what seemed like a simple meal. She placed each item down slowly, almost as if each one carried more meaning than just food. The cashier greeted her with a polite smile, scanning each item. The beeping of the machine sounded ordinary, but for the woman, it was the moment that would decide whether she had chosen right. As the total appeared on the screen, she leaned closer, her fingers already digging into the purse. She carefully poured out the coins, stacking them one by one on the counter. The cashier waited patiently, seeing the effort it took for her to count with hands that trembled slightly. At first, the amount seemed enough. The coins made a little pile, but as the cashier counted them quickly, his expression softened. The total was short only by 85. For most people, such a small amount would barely mean anything. But in that moment, it stood between her and her groceries. The elderly woman's eyes darted to the screen again. She looked at the coins, and then back at the bag of groceries. Her lips pressed together, and she gave a nervous smile, the kind that tries to hide embarrassment. She gently pushed one of the items aside, whispering under her breath that maybe she could return it. Her voice was low, almost apologetic, as if being short on change was a crime she had committed. The store had grown quieter. A few customers in line behind her noticed the situation. No one spoke, but the air seemed to carry a weight of silence. People shifted uncomfortably, watching her try to decide which item she could give up. The cashier's eyes softened even more as he saw her hesitate. He noticed how her shoulders slumped, how her fingers lingered on the bag of bread as if she didn't want to let it go. Her face showed more than worry about food. It showed the struggle of someone who had lived through many sacrifices, someone who had learned to do without, yet still found it painful when life reminded her that even the smallest amount could create a wall she could not climb. She murmured again that she would come back next week for the missing item, but her voice cracked just a little, betraying how much it hurt to let it go. For her, 85 was not just coins. It was the difference between leaving with her dignity intact or walking out with less than she needed. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The cashier could see that, though she tried to smile. Her eyes told another story, a story of quiet battles fought in silence, of days where she had to choose between one need and another. The little cloth purse now lay flat on the counter, empty. She looked inside one last time, as if hoping another coin might have hidden itself away. When she found nothing more, she folded it gently, her hands almost shaking, and placed it back into her bag. She gave the cashier a small nod, as though telling him to go ahead and remove something. The sound of coins rolling and clinking had stopped. The silence in the store grew heavier, every person in line aware that they were witnessing a moment of quiet struggle. The cashier glanced at the total again, then at the pile of coins, and then back at the woman's tired but gentle face. In that single second, he realized how much those few cents meant to her, and how much it hurt her pride to stand there unable to cover the full amount. He hesitated, as if searching for the right thing to do. His heart told him this wasn't about money at all. It was about kindness, dignity, and the value of a simple gesture. But before anything happened, before he reached for his pocket, before he could decide what action to take, the moment hung in the air. The elderly woman stood quietly, waiting, her groceries half-packed, her hope caught between a few missing coins and the mercy of someone who might understand. It was just 85. But in that instant, it was everything. The air inside the store felt heavy after that moment, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The elderly woman stood quietly, her small bag open on the counter, the groceries sitting in front of her. She was ready to give up one of the items, even though it was clear she needed each of them. Her eyes lowered, almost as if she didn't want anyone to see the sadness that flickered across her face. She gave a small sigh, the kind that carried years of unspoken struggles, and whispered that maybe the bread could be put back. Her voice trembled as though saying those words had cost her more than the missing coins. The cashier watched her carefully. He was a young man, tired from a long shift, but in that moment, all he could think about was how much this woman reminded him of his own grandmother. The way her hands shook slightly, the way her shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible weight, it struck something deep inside him. He could not just stand there and let her leave with less than she needed. For him, 85 was nothing, just a small coin that might have rolled under a car seat or been forgotten in a drawer. But for her, it was a mountain. Before she could push the bread fully aside, the cashier reached into his pocket. He didn't make a big announcement, and he didn't ask for permission. He simply pulled out a small handful of change, found the coin he needed, and quietly slid it into the register. With a calm smile, he told her not to worry about it, that everything was taken care of. He handed her the bag with all the groceries intact. His voice was soft but firm, the kind that made her look up in surprise. For a moment, she just stood there frozen, her eyes wide. It was as if she didn't believe what she had just heard. When the reality sank in, her lips parted and tears welled in her eyes. She tried to speak, to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she pressed her hand to her chest and whispered something faint, her gratitude spilling out not in grand sentences but in trembling breaths. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and deep relief, the kind of look that said she would remember this act of kindness for the rest of her life. Around them, the silence broke. A few people in line shifted, their expressions softening. Some smiled quietly, others looked away as though moved more deeply than they wanted to admit. One young woman near the back of the line discreetly pulled out her phone, recording the moment without making it obvious. To her, this was something the world needed to see, something rare and beautiful in a time when people often hurried past each other without noticing. The cashier didn't think about any of that. To him, it wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about doing something grand. It was about a simple decision. No one should have to walk away ashamed for being short by less than $1. He smiled gently as he placed the receipt in the bag and slid it toward her, as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The elderly woman's hands shook as she reached for the bag. She tried once more to speak, to explain how much it meant to her, but the tears finally slipped down her cheeks. She whispered a blessing under her breath, words meant only for him, words that carried the weight of her gratitude. The cashier simply nodded, his own heart full, not needing anything more than her smile. As she turned to leave, her steps seemed lighter than before. She clutched the bag to her chest, almost as though it carried more than food. It carried proof that kindness still lived in the world. Her eyes glistened, and when she passed the customers behind her, they nodded softly, some offering her warm smiles and silent support. The young woman with the phone lowered it slowly, her own eyes a little misty. She hadn't expected to capture something so touching on an ordinary shopping trip. She glanced at the cashier, who was already moving on to the next customer, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He did not look for praise, nor did he act like a hero. To him, it was just a simple gesture. But to everyone watching, it was much more dark by the time the elderly woman stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the street. She paused just outside the store, holding her groceries, her heart swelling with emotions she could barely describe. It wasn't just about the food. It was about being seen, being treated with respect, being reminded that she still mattered in a world that sometimes made her feel invisible. Inside, the cashier continued his work, unaware that his quiet action was already rippling outward, touching not only the woman he helped, but also the strangers who had witnessed it. A simple coin, a simple choice, had lit a spark that would soon grow far beyond the walls of that little store. That night, the small act that had taken place inside the grocery store began to travel far beyond its walls. The young woman who had quietly recorded the moment sat in her car afterward, replaying the short clip on her phone. She hadn't planned on capturing something so powerful. It had just happened in front of her, and she felt it needed to be remembered. The video showed the elderly woman's trembling hands, the pile of coins on the counter, and the quiet way the cashier slipped in his own change without hesitation. There was no dramatic speech, no announcement, just a simple gesture that spoke louder than words. When she got home, she decided to share the video online. She wrote a short post about what she had witnessed, explaining how such a small amount of money had carried so much weight and how the cashier's kindness had changed the atmosphere in the store. She didn't expect much to come from it, maybe a few likes or comments from her friends. But within hours, the post started spreading. Strangers began sharing it, adding their own thoughts about kindness, about humanity, about the way the smallest actions could mean the most. By the next morning, the video had reached thousands of people. It wasn't just being viewed, it was being talked about. People from different towns, even different countries, began leaving comments. Some shared stories of similar experiences, times when a stranger had stepped in to help them when they were short on money. Others admitted the video had brought tears to their eyes, saying it reminded them that good people still existed. The cashier had no idea any of this was happening. He was back at work the next day, stocking shelves, greeting customers, scanning groceries just like before. To him, what he had done was so small it wasn't worth mentioning. He hadn't even told his co-workers. But outside of the store, his simple act of covering 85 was inspiring conversations he couldn't have imagined. In a cafe across town, two friends sat together, watching the video on one of their phones. "It's not about the money," one of them said quietly. "It's about the heart behind it." In another city, a teacher showed the video to her class, using it as an example of how kindness could change lives. Children sat silently as they watched, their young minds absorbing the idea that even small gestures carried great power. As the video spread, the comments kept pouring in. Some people said they had been feeling hopeless lately, overwhelmed by negative news, but watching the clip gave them a reason to smile again. Others promised that the next time they saw someone in need, they would not hesitate to help. One person wrote, "He probably doesn't even realize it, but this cashier has reminded the whole world that goodness still matters." The elderly woman, meanwhile, went about her day unaware that her quiet moment of struggle had been seen by millions. She only carried with her the memory of the kind young man who had saved her from embarrassment and given her back her dignity. But for everyone online, she had become a symbol of resilience, and he had become a symbol of compassion. Together, their story had touched countless lives. News outlets soon began picking up the story. Headlines appeared on websites. "Cashier covers 85 for elderly woman. Inspires millions, and simple act of kindness goes viral." Reporters started searching for the store, hoping to find the cashier and speak to him. People wanted to hear his voice, to know what had gone through his mind at that moment. But when asked, he kept repeating the same thing. It was nothing special. He insisted that anyone else would have done the same. Yet, for the world watching, it was special. In a time when so many stories online were filled with conflict and negativity, this one stood out because it reminded people of the power of goodness. It wasn't about grand gestures or wealth. It was about a single coin, a single choice, and the ripple it created. Families gathered around dinner tables and spoke about it. Strangers on buses pulled out their phones and showed the clip to the person sitting next to them. Community leaders began to share it during speeches, pointing to it as proof that kindness could bring people together. A chain reaction had started, and it was all because of 85 and the compassion of one young cashier. Back at the grocery store, life looked ordinary. The cashier continued his shift, unaware that his simple smile and quiet action had reached across screens and hearts around the globe. But beyond those walls, his story had become more than just a moment in time. It had become a message of hope, reminding everyone who saw it that humanity was still alive and well. By the time the story reached the evening news, the small grocery store had already become the center of attention. Cars slowed as they passed, curious to see the place where it all happened. A few local reporters stood outside with their cameras, talking about the moment that had captured so many hearts. Inside, the cashier kept working, a little embarrassed by all the sudden attention. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He hadn't planned on anyone finding out. To him, it was just 85, but for the elderly woman, it was so much more. When she returned home that day, after the cashier helped her, she sat down at her small table, placed her groceries carefully in the kitchen, and let out a sigh of relief. She never knew that her quiet struggle and the young man's kindness were already traveling across phones and screens all over the world. She only knew that she would never forget the gentle smile he gave her when he told her not to worry, that it wasn't until a neighbor knocked on her door later that week that she learned what had happened. The neighbor held up her phone, showing her the video. At first, the elderly woman was shocked to see herself on the screen, her hands trembling over the counter, her purse laid open. She covered her mouth as she watched, tears welling in her eyes. "That's me," she whispered, almost in disbelief. She couldn't believe that people all around the world were now seeing a moment she thought was private, a moment of her own weakness and gratitude. But as she scrolled through the comments, her heart swelled. She saw strangers writing kind words about her, offering support, sending prayers, saying they wished they could hug her. Some even asked how they could send help. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She realized her struggle had touched people far beyond her neighborhood. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't only from sadness, they were from the overwhelming feeling of being seen and valued. Soon after, reporters came to speak with her. She was nervous at first, hesitant to share her story. She didn't want pity. She didn't want the world to see her as helpless. But when she finally spoke, her words were honest and simple. She explained that 85 might not mean much to most people, but for her, it meant the difference between leaving with her groceries or going without. She talked about how the cashier's small act of kindness had restored her dignity in a moment. When she felt it slipping away, her words resonated deeply with those watching. People saw her not as just another face in a video, but as a reminder of the quiet struggle so many go through each day. Viewers began sending letters to the grocery store, thanking the cashier and asking how they could help the elderly woman. Some mailed gift cards, others sent baskets of food. A local charity reached out and offered to support her with regular groceries, ensuring she would never again have to worry about being short at the register. The grocery store manager, who had once been strict about rules, found himself moved by the response. At first, he had been concerned about company policies cashiers weren't supposed to cover customer costs. But as he saw the world's reaction, he realized something important. Kindness could be more valuable than rules. He called the cashier into his office one morning, not to scold him, but to thank him. He told him that what he did had brought pride to the store, reminding everyone of what truly mattered. The cashier, humble as ever, lowered his head and admitted he never expected any of this. He said he only wanted the woman to have what she needed. He never imagined the world would care so much about something so small. But as the manager shook his hand, he finally began to understand that sometimes the smallest actions leave the greatest mark. Meanwhile, the elderly woman received visits from volunteers who wanted to make sure she was okay. Some came just to talk, to sit with her and share a cup of tea, letting her know she wasn't alone. For years she had lived quietly, often feeling forgotten. Now, people from her own community were coming forward, touched by her story, offering their friendship and care. The video that had once made her nervous to watch had become something she grew proud of. She realized it wasn't just about her struggle, it was about the kindness she received and how it inspired others. She often thought about the cashier and the way his small action had changed so much, not just for her, but for people everywhere. She whispered prayers for him each night, hoping he knew how much he had done. The story continued to spread, appearing on bigger networks, translated into different languages, retold in countless ways. Some called it the 85 miracle. Others described it as proof that humanity still had hope. Everywhere, people were talking about the same message: kindness matters. What began as a quiet moment at a grocery store counter had grown into something larger than anyone expected. The cashier had never sought fame. The elderly woman had never wanted attention. Yet together, their story reminded millions of people around the world that even the smallest act of compassion could ripple outward, and the story of the elderly woman and the cashier had reached far beyond the neighborhood grocery store. What began as a quiet act of kindness became something people were still talking about weeks later. On social media, the video continued to circulate, with millions of views and endless comments from strangers sharing their own stories of compassion. The simple moment of 85 had turned into a symbol, a reminder that small actions could carry immeasurable weight. The cashier, still working his usual shifts, often shook his head in disbelief at how big the story had become. Customers now came into the store not only to shop, but to meet him. Some stopped to shake his hand, others slipped notes of thanks across the counter, and many told him that his kindness had inspired them to help others. He never knew how to respond to the attention. He always said the same thing, that it wasn't a big deal, that he had only done what anyone should do. But deep down, he started to understand that the world wasn't reacting to the money. It was reacting to the spirit behind the gesture. The elderly woman's life also began to change. She received letters from people she had never met, letters filled with encouragement and love. Local organizations offered her assistance, making sure she had enough groceries, enough warmth, and enough company to no longer feel alone. For the first time in years, she felt the embrace of a community around her. She often sat at her kitchen table, reading the messages from strangers and smiling at the thought that her quiet, trembling moment at the register had become a beacon of hope for so many. One day, she returned to the store to shop again. This time, her steps felt lighter. She carried her small purse, but she no longer feared being short on coins. When she reached the counter, the cashier greeted her warmly. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, they shared an unspoken understanding of what their connection had started. She thanked him once more, her voice steady and strong, and though he tried to brush it off, she could see he was touched. The story didn't just fade into memory. It sparked something larger. Schools began using the video in classrooms, teaching children about kindness and empathy. Community leaders spoke about it during meetings, reminding people that change didn't always come from grand actions. It came from everyday choices. In towns and cities far away, people began paying for strangers' meals, covering bus fares, leaving coins at vending machines, or simply offering a smile to someone who looked like they needed it. Each act was small, but together they created a ripple that stretched across countless lives. The elderly woman often reflected on what had happened. She thought about the day she had stood at the counter, embarrassed and ready to give up her bread. She thought about how one young man's decision had spared her from that moment of loss. More than the groceries, what she carried with her now was the reminder that kindness still lived in people's hearts. It gave her strength. It gave her hope. For the cashier, life slowly returned to normal, though it never truly went back to the way it was. He continued working, but he also began to notice more kindness around him. Customers seemed gentler, more patient, more willing to help each other. Some even told him his story had pushed them to reconnect with family, to forgive old hurts, or to lend a hand where they once might have walked away. He realized then that kindness was contagious. His small coin had not only helped one woman, but had set off a chain reaction that reached people he would never meet. Months later, when the story finally settled into the background of daily life, its impact remained. People still remembered it, still shared it, still pointed to it as proof that good people exist. The phrase, "just 85 inches," became more than a number. It became a symbol of how little it takes to change a life. In the end, neither the cashier nor the elderly woman had sought the spotlight. They had simply lived through a moment where one person gave and another received. But together, they had shown the world something priceless, that even the smallest act of compassion could inspire hope, heal hearts, and remind us all of the humanity we share. And so, the story lived on not just in news articles or online posts, but in the everyday lives of those who carried its lesson forward. Because kindness, once given, never truly ends. It continues in the people it touches, echoing far beyond the moment itself.